The television flickered, a garish portal into a world that felt more distant than the moon. It was the annual Starlight Gala, a glittering spectacle of philanthropy and champagne-fueled self-congratulation that Tom only watched for the same reason people slow down to look at a car crash, a morbid, detached curiosity. He sat on the sagging sofa, the springs groaning in protest, the scent of sawdust and turpentine clinging to his worn flannel shirt. Beside him, a small warm weight was nestled into his side. Lily, his 6-year-old daughter, was completely mesmerized. Her chin propped in her hands, her wide cornflower blue eyes reflecting the shimmering gowns and flashing camera bulbs. She saw a fairy tale. He saw a mountain of bills he could never hope to climb. A woman draped in diamonds was laughing, her head thrown back in a silent peal that probably cost more than Tom's monthly rent. The reporter's voice droned on, a saccharine river of superlatives. And here he is now, the man of the hour, the titan of tech, whose generous donation tonight has shattered all previous records. Mr. Alistair Vance. The camera swiveled to a man who looked as if he'd been carved from granite and tailored by gods. He was tall, with stark, silver-streaked hair, and a face that betrayed no emotion. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute power, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He offered a few clipped, sterile words to the reporter, his eyes scanning the room, already bored. As he turned slightly to dismiss the fawning journalist, the camera, hungry for its subject, zoomed in tight. It lingered on the crisp lapel of his tuxedo, where a single, peculiar object was pinned. It wasn't a flower or a piece of jewelry. It was a medal, but not a polished government-issued one. This was different. It was rustic, almost crude, fashioned from hammered, mismatched metals, a 5-pointed star, with an odd, asymmetrical design, glinting dully under the harsh television lights. Tom's breath hitched in his throat. His heart gave a painful, violent lurch, a sudden shocking thud against his ribs. He knew that design. He knew the specific weight of it, the feel of its rough edges, the memory of the hands that had made it. Before the thought could fully form, before the wave of nausea and memory could crest over him, Lily's small voice, clear as a bell in the quiet room, sliced through the air. She sat bolt upright, her little body tense, and her finger shot out, smudging the dusty screen. "Papa!" she squealed, her voice a mixture of confusion and delight. "Papa, look! That's yours! That's my papa's star!" The world seemed to tilt and spin around Tom, the reporter's voice fading into a meaningless buzz, the glittering gala dissolving into a smear of light. All he could see was that medal on another man's chest, a ghost from a buried life, a life he had tried so desperately to forget. Tom's first instinct was to deny. It was a reflex, a muscle memory, honed over years of pushing away the past. "No, sweetie," he said, his voice strained, a rough, rusty thing. He tried to pull her finger away from the screen, but she was insistent. "It is! It is! It's the one you told me about. The bumpy one. The one Uncle David made for you in the sand." Her words were like tiny, sharp pebbles, striking a raw nerve. He hadn't spoken David's name in years. He hadn't told those stories since Sarah, before the world had collapsed. "It just looks like it, Lilybug. Lots of things in the world look the same." He tried for a reassuring smile, but it felt like a grimace, a stretching of dead skin. He could feel the cold sweat trickling down his back. Alistair Vance, the billionaire, was now walking away, the camera panning to follow him. But for a fleeting second, The metal caught the light again. There was no mistake. He could almost see the faint hand-scratched inscription on the back, the one he knew by heart. For Tom, my brother, D. He felt a surge of something hot and violent in his chest, a confusing cocktail of rage and profound soul-deep grief. How in God's name did that man have his medal? It was impossible. He'd lost it in the blur of eviction notices and cardboard boxes, in the chaotic, grief-stricken shuffle after Sarah's illness had taken its final, brutal toll. It was just one more thing the universe had ripped away from him. He had searched, of course. He'd torn apart boxes, emptied bags, sifted through the debris of his shattered life until his hands were raw and his hope was gone. He'd finally accepted it was lost forever, another casualty of his failure to hold his life together. And now, there it was, pinned to the tuxedo of a man who owned half the digital world, a man who wouldn't know the feel of grit in his teeth or the smell of cordite, a man who used $100 bills as bookmarks. It was a desecration, a cosmic joke of the cruelest kind. "Papa, are you okay?" Lily's voice was small now, tinged with worry. She had lowered her hand and was looking at him, her brow furrowed. She could always read him, his little girl. She saw the storm clouds gathering behind his eyes. He forced himself to take a deep breath, the air shuddering into his lungs. "I'm fine, sweetie. Just tired." He reached for the remote, his hand shaking slightly, and stabbed the power button. The screen went black, plunging the small, cluttered living room into the familiar dimness of a single, yellowed lamp. But the image was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The metal. Vance's indifferent face. Lily's righteous, innocent pronouncement. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with unspoken questions, and the ghosts of old stories. He pulled Lily into a hug, burying his face in her soft and candy-scented hair, holding on to her, as if she were the only thing keeping him from splintering into a million pieces. The past he had buried so deep wasn't dead. It was on television, and it was wearing his heart on its lapel. The next morning, the world had not reset itself. The memory of the gala, of the medal, clung to Tom like the damp chill of the pre-dawn apartment. He tried to dismiss it as a strange dream, a trick of the light and a tired mind. But Lily wouldn't let him. As he stood at the stove, stirring a pot of lumpy oatmeal, she sat at the wobbly kitchen table, a box of crayons and a piece of scrap paper in front of her. She was humming to herself, a tuneless, happy sound that usually soothed the ragged edges of his soul. But not today. Today it felt like a prelude to an interrogation. "Papa," she said, not looking up from her work, "why does that rich man have your star?" Her crayon, a waxy silver one, moved with intense concentration. "I told you, Lilybug, it's not mine. It just looks like it." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. "No," she said, her voice firm with the unshakable certainty of a 6-year-old. "It is. I remember the pointy bit on the top is a little bent, and one of the sides is fatter, like this." She held up her drawing. It was a child's scrawl, a lopsided silver star, but she had captured it with an unnerving accuracy. The bent top point, the slightly thicker arm on the right. Details a stranger wouldn't see. Details only someone who had held it, who had traced its imperfections with their own fingers, would know. He had let her play with it, once, in a different life. He'd sat on the floor of a sun-drenched living room, the smell of Sarah's baking in the air, and he'd told Lily the story. Not the real story, not the blood, and the fear and the screaming, but the sanitized, fairy tale version. A story about two very good friends, about being brave, about a special present. It was a story from a man he no longer was, a man who had a wife and a future. He took the drawing from her, his calloused thumb tracing the waxy lines. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He felt like he was standing on a cliff edge, the past a roaring ocean behind him. His daughter's innocent question a relentless wind at his back. He had to make her drop it, for his own sanity. It's a nice drawing, sweetie, but we have to get ready. School today. He tried to crumple the paper to make it disappear, but she snatched it back, her lower lip trembling. You don't believe me, she whispered, her eyes welling up with tears. You always said it was your most special thing. You said it was from your bestest friend in the whole world. The tears spilled over, tracing clean paths through the faint smudges of crayon dust on her cheeks. You said Uncle David was an angel now, and he gave it to you so you'd never forget to be brave. The words were a gut punch, each one a memory he had locked away in a dark, dusty room in his mind. He had said all those things, and in saying them, he had given her a piece of a story whose ending he could no longer control. He knelt in front of her, the oatmeal forgotten on the stove, and wiped her tears with his rough thumb. I believe you, Lilybug. I do. The admission was a surrender. I don't understand how it could be. But as he looked into her pleading, tear-filled eyes, he knew he couldn't leave it at that. Her world was built on the foundations of his words, on the belief that her papa was a hero, that he told the truth. To deny her now would be to crumble that foundation. It would be another loss, another failure, and he couldn't bear another one. Okay, he sighed, the single word feeling heavier than any piece of lumber he'd ever lifted. Okay, we'll figure it out. He had no idea what that meant. What could he possibly do? Write a letter to a billionaire? Dear Mr. Vance, I believe you have a piece of my soul pinned to your suit. Could I please have it back? He was a carpenter, a handyman. He fixed leaky faucets and hung drywall. He didn't move in circles where you could just call up a titan of industry. The gulf between his world and Alistair Vance's was not just about money. It was astronomical, a chasm of power and influence he couldn't possibly cross. That afternoon, while Lily was at school, Tom found himself sitting in front of the local library's ancient beige computer. The dial-up screech of the internet connection felt like a fitting soundtrack to his absurd mission. He typed Alistair Vance into the search bar, his fingers clumsy on the sticky keyboard. The screen flooded with images of the man. Vance shaking hands with presidents, Vance christening a yacht, Vance standing in front of impossibly tall glass buildings that bore his name. He was the founder and CEO of Vance Dynamics, a sprawling tech conglomerate that had its tendrils in everything from satellite communications to artificial intelligence. His net worth had more zeros than Tom could comfortably count. He was a phantom, a brand, a walking corporation. Tom found a Contact Us page on the Vance Dynamics corporate website. It was a sterile form, demanding a name, an email address, and a reason for inquiry from a drop-down menu that included options like investor relations, press inquiry, and product support. There was no option for reclaiming a lost piece of your past. He selected Other and hesitated, the cursor blinking mockingly in the empty message box. What could he possibly write that wouldn't sound insane? He typed and deleted, typed and deleted for the better part of an hour. "My daughter saw you on TV," sounded pathetic. "You are in possession of my personal property," sounded aggressive and delusional. He finally settled on something simple, something that felt honest, however hopeless. "To whom it may concern. My name is Tom Shelton. I am a former Army Ranger. I believe a medal that was displayed by Mr. Alastair Vance at the Starlight Gala on October 5th may be a personal item of mine, a custom-made piece of great sentimental value that was lost some years ago. It was made by a fallen comrade and is irreplaceable. I would be grateful for any information regarding how it came into his possession. I can provide a detailed description. Thank you for your time. Tom Shelton." He read it over a dozen times. It sounded flimsy. The desperate plea of a nobody. He clicked send before he could lose his nerve, watching the confirmation message flash on the screen with a sense of profound futility. It was a message in a bottle, tossed into a digital ocean. He knew with a certainty that settled like a stone in his stomach that it would be read by a junior assistant, flagged as spam, and deleted within seconds. He left the library feeling smaller and more foolish than when he had entered, the gap between his world and Vance's seeming to have widened into an impassable canyon. Days turned into a week. The lumpy oatmeal of morning gave way to the sawdust of the day and the cheap, microwaved dinners of evening. Life went on in its relentless, grinding way. An automated no-reply email had appeared in his inbox the day after his inquiry. "Thank you for contacting Vance Dynamics. We receive a high volume of correspondence and will respond to your query if and when appropriate. We thank you for your understanding." It was the corporate equivalent of a brick wall. Tom tried to put it out of his mind, to convince himself he had done his due diligence, had fulfilled his promise to Lily, but she was a dog with a bone. Every evening she would ask, "Did the rich man email you back, Papa?" Every evening he would have to tell her no, and a little bit of the light in her eyes would dim. He saw the doubt starting to creep in, not about the medal, but about him, about his ability to fix things, to make things right. That was the part that hurt the most. He was her hero, her giant, the man who could fix any broken toy and scare away any monster under the bed. But he was powerless against this. One rainy Saturday, with a carpentry job canceled, and the walls of their small apartment feeling like they were closing in, Tom found himself rummaging through a battered tin footlocker in the back of his closet. It was the only thing, besides Lily, that he had managed to keep from his old life. It held the detritus of his service: old uniforms, faded photographs, letters from home with Sarah's looping, optimistic handwriting. And at the very bottom, tucked inside a worn copy of Leaves of Grass that David had given him, was a photograph. It was taken in the dusty, sun-bleached landscape of Afghanistan. Two young men, barely out of their teens, grinning at the camera, their faces smeared with dirt and sweat, their youth and bravado a stark contrast to the harsh reality around them. He was on the left, his arms slung around the shoulders of his best friend. David was laughing, his head thrown back, a beacon of life and light. And there, hanging from a leather cord around Tom's neck, was the medal. The photograph was grainy, but it was undeniable. The bent point, the thicker arm, clear as day. He hadn't looked at this photo in 6 years. The pain was too much. It was the pain of survival, of coming home when David didn't. The medal wasn't just a symbol of bravery. It was a symbol of his failure. He had saved David's life in the firefight it commemorated, pulling him out of the line of fire after an IED had torn through their convoy. But 3 weeks later, on a routine patrol he should have been on, David had been killed by a sniper. Survivor's guilt was a poison, and this medal was its vessel. He had loved it and hated it in equal measure. Losing it had been, in a strange, twisted way, a kind of relief, a lifting of a burden he didn't know how to carry. Lily padded into the bedroom, her footsteps silent. "Who's that, Papa?" she asked, pointing at the photo. "That's your Uncle David," Tom said, his voice thick. "The one who made the star." "You look happy," she said quietly, her little finger tracing the outline of his younger smiling face. "I was," he heard himself say. "We were." He showed her the medal in the photo, and her eyes lit up with vindication. "See? I told you. It's the same one." He nodded slowly, the photograph a tangible piece of evidence in a world that felt increasingly unreal. This wasn't just a feeling anymore. This was a fact. And as he looked at the picture of the smiling, vibrant young man who had hammered that star out of scrap metal in a dusty tent thousands of miles from home, a different feeling began to smolder beneath the grief and resignation. It was anger, a clean, sharp anger. That medal didn't belong in a billionaire's collection. It wasn't an asset. It wasn't an antique. It was a promise. It was a life. And he was going to get it back. The how was still a vast, terrifying unknown, but the why had never been clearer. It wasn't just for him anymore. It was for Lily. And it was for David. Tom's newfound resolve quickly slammed back into the same brick wall. He tried calling the corporate headquarters. He navigated an endless, infuriating phone tree, his voice growing hoarse as he repeated his story to a series of increasingly dismissive receptionists and assistants, each one a gatekeeper to a gatekeeper. He was transferred, put on hold, and ultimately disconnected. He was a gnat buzzing against a fortress of glass and steel. He felt his anger dissolving back into the familiar, bitter sludge of helplessness. He was out of his depth, a fish trying to climb a tree. It was Lily who, in her infinite and innocent wisdom, found another way. She had a friend in the apartment complex, a 10-year-old boy named Leo, who was never seen without a tablet in his hands, and who spoke in a strange dialect of memes and internet acronyms. Tom had seen them whispering together on the steps of the building, Lily looking serious, Leo nodding with the gravity of a seasoned general planning a campaign. He thought they were just playing. He was wrong. One evening, as he was trying to patch a particularly stubborn hole in a pair of Lily's jeans, his old, cracked smartphone buzzed on the table. It was a notification from a social media app he barely used, one Sarah had set up for him years ago to share pictures with her family. A new video had been posted to his account. He frowned, confused, and tapped on it. The video flickered to life. It was shaky, filmed in the dim light of Lily's bedroom. Lily herself was staring directly into the camera, her expression one of profound seriousness. In one hand, she held her crayon drawing of the star. In the other, she held up Tom's phone, displaying a paused image from a news clip of the gala she must have found online. She had placed her drawing right next to the image of Vance's lapel. The comparison was striking. "Hello," she said, her voice small but clear. "My name is Lily. This," she pointed a chubby finger at the drawing, "is my papa's star. And this," she pointed at the screenshot, "is my papa's star too." She took a deep breath, like she was about to recite a poem in a school play. "Mr. Vance, you have my papa's special star. He was a hero. His best friend, Uncle David, made it for him in the sand. But he's an angel now. My papa lost it when my mommy became an angel too. It's his most special thing. He needs it back. Please give it back." The video ended abruptly. Tom sat there, stunned, the needle and thread forgotten in his hand. His heart was pounding, a wild drumbeat against his ribs. It was the most audacious, terrifying, and beautiful thing he had ever seen. He didn't know whether to be angry at her for going behind his back or to weep with pride at her fierce, unwavering loyalty. He found Lily in her room, putting her crayons away. She looked up at him, her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Leo helped me," she said, her voice a whisper. "He said this is how you talk to famous people now." Tom sank onto her small bed, the phone still in his hand. He wasn't angry. All the fight had gone out of him, replaced by a wave of overwhelming love for this tiny, formidable person. She had done what he couldn't. She had simply told the truth, broadcasting it out into the void with the pure, unshakable faith that someone would listen. He pulled her into a hug, his face buried in her hair. "You are a little warrior, you know that?" he murmured. She hugged him back tightly. "Are you mad?" "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Lilybug, I'm not mad." He had no idea what would happen next. The video would probably get 3 views and be lost in the endless scroll of digital noise. But it didn't matter. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel entirely alone in the fight. He had his daughter, a 10-year-old tech guru, and a crayon drawing of a star. It wasn't much, but it was a start. For 2 days, nothing happened. The video sat on his dormant social media page with a handful of views, likely just from Leo and a few of Sarah's distant relatives. The silence was a confirmation of Tom's deepest fears, that they were invisible, their voices too small to be heard over the roar of the world. He was ready to let it go, to tell Lily they had tried their best. But then, on the 3rd day, something shifted. A comment appeared on the video. It was from a woman who ran a small local blog about Veterans Affairs. "What a powerful story. Can you please contact me? I'd like to hear more." Tom hesitated, his distrust of the media, of anyone outside his small circle, warring with a flicker of hope. He showed the comment to Lily, and her eyes lit up. "She wants to help, Papa." With a deep breath, he sent the woman a private message. She replied almost instantly. Her name was Maria. Her father was a veteran. She understood. She asked if she could write a short piece about it, to share the video on her blog's social media pages. Tom, feeling like he had nothing left to lose, agreed. The blog post went up that afternoon. It was simple, respectful, and powerful. Maria had embedded Lily's video and written a few paragraphs outlining the story. The heroic father, the fallen friend, the lost symbol of a sacred bond, and the daughter's simple plea. She used a headline that was both poignant and provocative. "A billionaire's bauble or a hero's heart?" 6-year-old asks Alistair Vance to return her father's lost medal. Then she added a hashtag. "Give Papa his medal." It was like striking a match in a dry forest. The blog's followers, mostly veterans, their families, and supporters, shared it immediately. From there, it leapt into the wider digital world. People were drawn to the raw authenticity of Lily's plea. The story had all the elements of a modern-day fable. The humble, forgotten hero the innocent child, and the distant, powerful billionaire. It was David versus Goliath, played out in pixels and shares. By evening, the hashtag was trending in their city. By the next morning, it was trending nationally. Tom's phone, which usually only buzzed for low battery warnings, began to light up and chime incessantly. Notifications, messages, friend requests from strangers all over the country. He watched bewildered as the view count on Lily's video climbed from dozens to hundreds, then to thousands, then to hundreds of thousands. It was terrifying. His small private world had been blown wide open. Reporters started calling, their numbers somehow dredged up from the depths of the internet. A news van from a local TV station parked across the street from their apartment building. A camera lens pointed at their window like a sniper's scope. He felt exposed, violated. He drew the curtains and refused to answer the door or the phone. He wanted it to stop. He had wanted the medal back, but he hadn't wanted this. He hadn't wanted his life, his grief, his past, to become a public spectacle. He had wanted a quiet resolution, not a digital crusade. Lily, however, was unfazed. She watched the news report about her video with a sense of calm satisfaction. "They're helping, Papa," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Now he has to listen. In a sterile, soundproofed boardroom on the 85th floor of the Vance Dynamics Tower, Alistair Vance was listening, and he was irritated. His head of public relations, a sharp-faced woman named Cynthia, stood before a massive screen displaying the surging metrics of the Augie A Give Papa His Medal campaign. "It's got legs, Alistair," she said, her tone grim. "The narrative is compelling. We're being cast as the villain." Vance barely looked up from the quarterly report he was reading on his tablet. "Villain? Over a trinket? Issue a statement. We acquired the item legally through a reputable estate auction years ago. End of story." "It's not that simple," Cynthia countered, swiping the screen to show Lily's video. The sound was off, but the image of the earnest little girl holding her crayon drawing was potent. "This is emotional. Facts won't kill it. A legalistic denial will make us look like heartless bullies. The story is already being framed as a moral issue, not a legal one." Vance finally looked at the screen, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "So, some guy lost a piece of junk, and his kid is crying about it on the internet. Why is this my problem?" He tapped his pen on the polished mahogany table. He hadn't even remembered the medal until Cynthia had brought it to his attention. He'd bought it at a small, exclusive auction that specialized in unique military and historical artifacts. He'd been drawn to its raw, primitive design, a stark contrast to the polished metals and gleaming silverware that surrounded it. He'd worn it once or twice to these kinds of galas as a conversation piece, an affectation of ruggedness that belied his surgically precise, data-driven life. It was an asset, an object, nothing more. "The junk, as you call it, was apparently handmade in a war zone by a soldier who was later killed in action," Cynthia said, her voice dry. "The man claiming it's his is a decorated veteran who fell on hard times after his wife died. The optics are, to put it mildly, abysmal." Vance let out an exasperated sigh. This was a distraction, a frivolous, emotional variable in his carefully calculated world. He dealt in algorithms and market projections, not in sentimental stories. "Offer him money," he said flatly. "A generous amount. Make him sign a non-disclosure agreement. Bury it." "We tried," Cynthia admitted, looking uncomfortable. "We reached out through a third party. He refused, said it wasn't about money." This gave Vance pause. Everything was about money. It was the universal language, the ultimate motivator. For someone to refuse a generous offer, it was illogical. It was inefficient. It was interesting. He refused, flatly. "Fine," Vance said, standing up, his patience gone. "Then we ignore it. This is a 24-hour news cycle. In 2 days, they'll be chasing some other sob story. Let them scream into the void. We don't engage. We don't acknowledge. We starve it of oxygen." He turned and walked towards the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to Cynthia and the image of Lily on the screen. He looked down at the city sprawling beneath him, a complex network of systems and patterns that he understood, that he could control. This was his world. Concrete. Data. Power. He would not be swayed by a child's drawing and a ghost story. The fortress would not lower its drawbridge for a gnat. But the story didn't die. It grew. Other veterans who had served with Tom and David started to see the news. They began to come forward, creating their own videos, corroborating the story. A grizzled, gray-haired man, who had been their platoon sergeant, spoke to a news crew from his porch in rural Texas. "Tom Shelton was one of the best men I ever had," he said, his voice raspy with emotion. "And Dave Miller. That kid had a heart the size of this state. I remember that medal. Dave was so proud of it. Hammered it out of a piece of a busted-up Humvee. Said it was a real hero's medal, not some piece of brass a general pins on you. For that thing to be on some billionaire's suit, it's a disgrace. It's a violation of something sacred." The interview went viral, adding a powerful layer of authenticity and righteous anger to the narrative. The story was no longer just about a father and a daughter. It was about respect, honor, and the promises made between soldiers. The pressure mounted. Talk show hosts dissected the story. Pundits debated the moral obligations of the ultra-rich. The Vance Dynamics social media pages were flooded with angry comments and a torrent of the "Us give Papa his medal" hashtag. It was becoming a PR nightmare, a firestorm that couldn't be ignored or extinguished with money. In his penthouse apartment, a vast, minimalist space that felt more like a modern art gallery than a home, Alistair Vance found himself unable to escape the story. It was on every channel, every news site he scrolled through. His carefully curated world was being invaded by this messy, emotional narrative. Annoyance was curdling into a strange, unfamiliar feeling of being besieged. That evening, he dismissed his staff and walked to the climate-controlled vault where he kept his collection of art and artifacts. He keyed in the code, and the heavy door hissed open. He walked past a Monet and a small Rodin sculpture to a velvet-lined drawer. He opened it. There, nestled on the black velvet, was the medal. He picked it up for the first time in years. It was heavier than it looked. He ran his thumb over its rough, uneven surface. It felt real, solid. It wasn't like the sleek, frictionless technology he dealt with every day. It had texture. It had flaws. It had a history he could feel in its very composition. He had never bothered to look at the back. He turned it over now. His sharp eyes, trained to spot market fluctuations and contractual loopholes, easily made out the crude, hand-etched inscription. For Tom, my brother, D. My brother. The words seemed to hang in the silent, sterile air of the vault. It wasn't a label or a serial number. It was a declaration, a bond. He had collected objects his entire life, things of value, of beauty, of historical significance. But this was the first time an object had ever felt like it was talking back, telling him a story he didn't want to hear. A story where he was not the protagonist. He closed the drawer and went back to his living area. On a giant, wall-mounted screen, he pulled up Lily's video. He had only seen snippets before, in Cynthia's presentation. Now he watched it from the beginning, turning the sound on. He listened to her small, clear voice. "He needs it back. Please give it back." There was no artifice in her plea, no guile. It was a simple, powerful truth. He looked around his vast, empty apartment, the priceless art on the walls, the breathtaking view of the city lights. He had everything a man could ever want, and yet his life was as silent and sterile as the vault he had just left. He had business associates, not brothers. He had transactions, not bonds. For the first time, Alistair Vance felt a crack in the armor of his own certainty. He was a man who solved problems, who dominated systems. And this was a problem of a kind he had never encountered before. A problem that couldn't be solved with a calculation or a checkbook. He watched the video again, and something in the little girl's eyes, a fierce, protective love for her father, resonated in a place deep inside him he had long forgotten existed. It was the hollow space where his own childhood was supposed to be. The media scrum outside the apartment building had become a semi-permanent fixture. Tom felt like a prisoner in his own home. He and Lily played board games, read books, and tried to ignore the world outside their window. But the pressure was immense. He was just a man, a carpenter. He wasn't built for this kind of scrutiny. He was beginning to regret ever letting it get this far. Doubt was his constant companion. What if Vance sued him for harassment, for slander? What if they came after him, dug into his past, used his financial struggles to paint him as a grifter, a con man trying to extort a rich man? He was terrified. One morning, the buzzing from the intercom was more insistent than usual. He ignored it, as he had been doing for days. But then his phone rang. It was an unknown number, but something made him answer it. "Mr. Shelton?" The voice was female, crisp and professional. "My name is Cynthia Dean. I'm the head of public relations for Alistair Vance. Mr. Vance would like to meet with you." Tom's blood ran cold. "I have nothing to say to him." "He isn't calling to debate the issue, Mr. Shelton. He wants to come to you, to your apartment. Now." The audacity of it was staggering. "You think you could just summon me? Send a car and have me brought to your tower?" "No, Mr. Shelton," the voice replied, a hint of weariness in it. "I think you misunderstand. He is on his way to you. He'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Tom stared at the phone, his heart hammering against his ribs. Vance was coming here? To this small, run-down apartment? It had to be a stunt, a publicity move. He would arrive with a phalanx of cameras, hand over the medal, in a staged photo op, and emerge looking like a benevolent king. He looked around the cluttered living room, the sagging sofa, the pile of Lily's toys in the corner, the faint smell of stale coffee. He felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a surge of defiant anger. Let him come. Let him see. Let the whole world see the chasm between their lives. He went to the door and looked through the peephole. The reporters were still there, milling about, but there was a new energy, a buzz of anticipation. They knew something was happening. He turned to Lily, who was sitting on the floor, lining up her plastic dinosaurs. "Lily, bug," he said, his voice low and steady. "We're going to have a visitor. A man is coming to see us. I need you to be a brave girl and stay close to me, okay?" She looked up, her eyes wide. "Is it the rich man?" Tom nodded grimly. "It is." A sleek black town car, the kind that seemed to absorb light, pulled up to the curb. The reporters surged forward like a single, ravenous organism, cameras flashing, microphones extended. The car door opened, and Alistair Vance emerged. He wasn't flanked by security. He was alone. He wore a simple, dark cashmere sweater and trousers, no tie, no suit of armor. He looked smaller in person, less like a monument and more like a man. He ignored the shouted questions from the press, his face an unreadable mask, and walked directly to the front door of the building. Tom watched through the peephole as Vance spoke into the intercom. A moment later, the buzzer in his own apartment shrieked. He took a deep breath and pressed the button to let him in. The seconds that followed were the longest of Tom's life. He could hear the heavy, expensive footsteps ascending the worn linoleum of the stairwell. He put a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. Then there was a firm, quiet knock on the door. He opened it. Alistair Vance stood in the dim hallway, his height seeming to fill the entire space. His eyes, a startlingly pale gray, met Tom's. They were not cold or dismissive. They were searching. There was an awkward, protracted silence. The air crackled with unspoken accusations and years of disparate life experience. The billionaire looked past Tom, his gaze taking in the small, humble apartment. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a quiet observation that seemed to acknowledge the vast gulf between them. Finally, Vance spoke, his voice softer than it sounded on television. "Mr. Shelton." "Vance," Tom replied, his own voice hard, defensive. He would not be intimidated, not in his own home. Vance's gaze dropped to Lily, who was peeking out from behind Tom's legs, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. She was staring at the man from the TV, the man with her papa's star. Vance didn't offer a handshake or a hollow apology. He didn't try to explain or justify. He simply reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a small, heavy object. He held it out on the palm of his hand. The medal. It lay there, glinting under the weak light of the hallway bulb. It looked 1,000 times more real, more potent than it ever had on a screen. The bent point, the fatter arm, the rugged, imperfect soul of it. "I believe," Alistair Vance said, his voice quiet but clear, "that this is yours." Tom stared at the medal in Vance's outstretched hand, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. He had imagined this moment 100 times, and in every version he was the one in control, filled with righteous fury, delivering a speech that would put the billionaire in his place. But now, faced with the quiet, unadorned reality of it, the anger felt hollow. All he felt was a profound, bone-deep weariness, and a sorrow so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. The medal wasn't a trophy to be won. It was a wound to be reopened. Before he could react, before he could find the words he was looking for, Lily moved. She wriggled out from behind his legs, stepping forward with a confidence that stunned him. She didn't go for the medal. She walked right up to the towering, intimidating figure of Alistair Vance, reached up with her small hands, and wrapped them around his leg in a hug. Vance froze. He looked down at the small girl clinging to him, as if he'd never been touched by another human being before. A look of profound, unadulterated shock crossed his features, breaking through the carefully constructed mask of indifference. He was completely, utterly flummoxed. "Thank you," Lily's muffled voice came from the fabric of his expensive trousers. "Thank you for finding Papa's star." That was it. That was the moment the dam broke. The simple, uncalculated purity of her gratitude did what all the media pressure and public shaming in the world could not. It reached across the chasm of wealth and power and found the man inside the mogul. Tom watched as Vance, stiffly, awkwardly, bent down and placed a hesitant hand on Lily's head. When he looked back up at Tom, the cool gray eyes were glistening with an unfamiliar moisture. The armor was gone. In that moment, Tom didn't see a titan of industry. He saw a man who was desperately, achingly lonely. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Vance nodded, and as Lily let go of his leg, he stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind him, closing out the noise of the world. The apartment seemed to shrink with another person in it, especially a person of Vance's stature. He stood awkwardly in the center of the living room, a giant in a doll's house, looking out of place and profoundly uncomfortable. Tom walked over and took the medal from his still outstretched hand. The cool, familiar weight of it settled into his palm. It was like feeling a phantom limb reattach itself. He ran his thumb over the inscription on the back, the letters a familiar map beneath his skin. All the stories, all the pain, all the love that were hammered into that piece of metal came flooding back. He sank onto the edge of his sagging sofa, the metal clutched in his fist, and finally, after 6 long years, he let himself weep. They were not loud, racking sobs, but silent, bitter tears that tracked paths through the sawdust and grime of his life. Tears for David, tears for Sarah, tears for the man he used to be. Lily, seeing his distress, rushed to his side, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "It's okay, Papa. You got it back. It's okay." Vance stood there, a silent, awkward witness. He looked as if he wanted to bolt, to flee back to his world of predictable, manageable data. But he didn't. He stayed. He waited, respectfully, until Tom's shoulders stopped shaking, and he had wiped his eyes on the sleeve of his flannel shirt. "Tell me about him," Vance said, his voice quiet. It wasn't a demand. It was a request. Tom looked up, surprised. "Who?" "The man who made it," Vance said, gesturing toward the medal. "Your brother." And so, in the cluttered living room of his tiny apartment, with a billionaire standing awkwardly by his dusty television, Tom Shelton began to talk. He told him about David Miller, about his infectious laugh, his terrible singing, his unshakable belief that they were the good guys, that they were making a difference. He told him about the day of the IED, the chaos, the smoke, the blood. He described the feeling of pulling his friend's dead weight out of the wreckage, the desperate, frantic effort to keep him alive. And he told him about the weeks that followed, about David hammering away at a piece of shrapnel in their tent, pouring all his gratitude and love into this one crude object. He told him about the guilt, the crushing weight of being the one who lived. He spoke for a long time, the words pouring out of him, a confession and a eulogy all in one. Vance listened, his expression intent, his focus absolute. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer platitudes. He just listened. When Tom finally fell silent, his voice hoarse, a strange sort of peace settled over the room. The telling of the story had been a release, a lancing of a wound that had been festering for years. "My father," Vance said, his voice low, breaking the silence, "was a colonel in the Air Force, a career man. He collected military decorations. His office was filled with them, all polished, all in neat glass cases. He never earned a single one of them himself. They were all from his father, his grandfather. He just acquired them. He paused, his eyes distant. He was a hard man, cold. I don't think he ever told me he was proud of me. When he died, he left me his company and his collection. I sold most of the medals. They were just things, objects in a case. They didn't mean anything. He looked at the medal in Tom's hand. That, he said, with a newfound understanding, that means something. They sat in silence for another moment, two men from different universes, finding a fragile, unexpected sliver of common ground in the long shadows cast by their fathers. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something quieter, a simple human acknowledgement, a recognition. Alistair Vance's departure was as quiet and understated as his arrival. He said a simple, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Shelton," and a soft, "It was a pleasure to meet you, Lily." He walked out of the apartment and into the waiting storm of the press. But this time, he didn't ignore them. He stopped on the front steps, held up a hand for silence, and the cacophony died down. "The medal has been returned to its rightful owner, Mr. Tom Shelton," Vance said, his voice calm and clear, carrying in the crisp autumn air. "There will be no further comment on the matter other than to say that I was wrong. I apologize to Mr. Shelton and his family. The story behind this medal is one of profound friendship, sacrifice, and honor. I am grateful to have been reminded of what those words truly mean." He then turned and got into his car without another word, leaving a stunned and silent press corps in his wake. The story exploded, but the narrative had completely flipped. The headlines that evening were not about a billionaire's defeat, but about his unexpected display of grace and humility. Vance was no longer the villain. He was the redeemed. His company's stock, which had taken a slight dip during the controversy, rebounded, and then some. In the world of public relations, it was a masterstroke, but Tom knew it hadn't been a calculated move. He had seen the look in Vance's eyes. It had been genuine. The days that followed were a whirlwind. The reporters disappeared. The flood of messages on his phone slowed to a trickle, now overwhelmingly positive and supportive. But the biggest change was yet to come. A week after his visit, a package arrived for Tom. It was from a law firm. Inside was a thick sheaf of documents. It wasn't a lawsuit. It was a proposal. Alistair Vance, the documents stated, was establishing a new charitable foundation, the Brothers Keeper Foundation, dedicated to providing financial, vocational, and mental health support to veterans and their families. The initial endowment was a staggering sum of money. The letter went on to explain that Mr. Vance believed the foundation needed guidance from someone with first-hand experience of the challenges veterans face. It was offering Tom Shelton a position on the foundation's advisory board. It was not a figurehead role. It was a real job, with real responsibilities and a salary that made Tom's eyes water. It was more money than he had ever dreamed of making in a year, let alone a month. His first instinct was to refuse. It felt like charity, a payoff. His pride bristled at the thought, but as he read further, he saw the sincerity in the proposal. It wasn't about him. The foundation was real. The mission was vital. He thought about all the other veterans he knew, men who had come home from the war with visible and invisible scars, men who had struggled to find work, to keep their families together, to navigate the labyrinth of bureaucracy, to get the help they deserved. He thought about David. This was the kind of work David would have championed. To refuse would be an act of selfishness, of pride. It would be letting the past and his own insecurities win. He took the job. The change was not instantaneous, but it was profound. The first thing he did was move. He found a small 2-bedroom house for rent in a quiet, leafy suburb, the kind of place he and Sarah had always dreamed of. It had a small yard for Lily to play in, and more importantly, it had a garage. For the first time in years, he had a space to set up a proper workshop. The advisory board meetings were strange and intimidating at first. He sat at a long, polished table with lawyers, accountants, and non-profit executives, a man who smelled of sawdust in a world that smelled of money and ambition. But he quickly realized that his voice was the most important one in the room. He spoke about the realities of life after service, about the gaps in the system, about the simple human needs that were so often overlooked. He helped shape the Foundation's policies, directing funds towards practical, on-the-ground initiatives, job training programs, family counseling services, emergency housing grants. He found a new purpose, a new mission. He saw Alistair Vance at these meetings. Their interactions were professional, cordial. The strange, raw intimacy of their meeting in his apartment was never spoken of, but it was always there, an unspoken understanding between them. Vance had changed. He seemed less sterile. He listened more. He had started visiting VA hospitals and community centers, not with a press corps in tow, but quietly, on his own. He was, in his own methodical, data-driven way, trying to understand. One afternoon, Tom was in his new workshop, the smell of freshly cut pine filling the air. He was working on a custom-built bookcase for a new client. He had started his own small carpentry business, Shelton and Daughter Woodworks, taking on special projects, his passion for the craft rekindled. The work was therapeutic, the shaping of raw wood into something beautiful and useful, a balm for his soul. The metal was not in a case on the mantelpiece. It sat on his workbench, next to his chisels and his sanding block. It was a part of his life now, not a relic of the past. It was a silent companion, a reminder not of what he had lost, but of what he had survived and what he was building. Lily ran into the workshop, her face bright. "Papa, Mr. Vance is on the phone. He wants to talk about the playground project." Tom smiled and wiped his hands on a rag. He picked up the phone, and a familiar, quiet voice was on the other end. They weren't exactly friends, he and Alistair Vance. They were two men from different worlds, bound by a strange twist of fate and a hammered piece of metal. But as they discussed the plans for a new, fully accessible playground to be built near the VA hospital, Tom realized they had become something more than adversaries or associates. They were partners. They were, in a strange and unexpected way, brothers in a shared mission. Later that evening, as the sun set, casting long shadows across the yard, Tom sat on the back porch, watching Lily swing on the new swing set he had built for her. The metal was in his pocket, its familiar weight a comforting presence. He thought of David, of his laughter, and his loyalty. The grief was still there, a dull, permanent ache in his heart. But it was no longer a poison. It was just a part of him. He knew, with a quiet certainty, that David would be proud of the man he had become, the father he was, the work he was doing. Lily's laughter pealed through the quiet twilight, a sound more precious than any collection of jewels or art. He looked at his home, at his daughter, at the life he was slowly, carefully rebuilding, and he understood. True wealth wasn't about what you acquired. It was about what you held on to, what you honored, and what you refused to let go. And it could all start with the smallest voice, in the smallest room, simply telling the truth.